Bay. I'm the chair of the section of litigation. We are here in my hometown of St. Louis. The section of litigation is very proud to present an extraordinary plenary, Lessons in Leadership from the Civil Rights Movement. When I first decided to have this meeting here in St. Louis, I wanted to focus on civil rights and the issue of leadership. St. Louis is a city with its own history on these issues. The Dred Scott case was first decided at the trial level here just a few blocks away at the old courthouse, and still standing in a national landmark. We have had our share of challenges. We have had our share of leaders like Frankie Freeman, who you will hear from. But first you're going to hear from Paulette Brown. She's our program chair, and she is an extraordinary speaker, an extraordinary moderator. Her bio, as well as the bios of all the speakers, are in the materials at your desk. Paulette is a partner at Edwards, Angle, Palmer & Dodge and practices from her office in New Jersey. She's a past national president of the National Bar Association. She's a past member of the American Bar Association's Board of Governors. She's a past member of our council. She's an extraordinary lawyer. She's an extraordinary leader of our association, and equally important, my friend. Paulette Brown, come address us.
Good morning. Good morning. Oh, I love that rousing good morning. Thank you, Bill, for your vision, and I'd like to thank the mayor, although he's left, for coming by from what must be an extraordinary busy schedule. I have to tell all of you that I am extremely excited about today's program, both with the panel you're about to see and the panel that will follow it. Bill, I really want to thank you for this vision and giving me personally the opportunity to participate in this program. It is just such an extraordinary honor for me. And now, to all of you, when this program is over, I hope that, and it is the hope not just of me, but for Bill and for everyone here, that you will have a number of takeaways, some lessons that you will actually learn. You'll find out things that you didn't know, or things that you should have known that you didn't know. And we hope that you will be able to carry that forward in all of the work that you do for the section. So Bill said that he chose St. Louis. He said it's because there's a lot of history. There is a lot of history here. And Bill is, of course, from here, so that had a major part to do with it. But a lot of times people think of the civil rights movement as being from the period of the mid-1950s through the mid-1970s. They think in terms of the civil rights movement perhaps starting with the Brown versus Board of Education case. But it actually started, in my opinion, right here in St. Louis with the Dred Scott decision and with the lawyer who represented Dred Scott ultimately, who was Roswell Field. And Roswell Field was not Dred Scott's first lawyer. His first lawyers, he had a few of them before, and they pretty much abandoned him. But Roswell Field stood up, took leadership, and said, this is a case that must go forward. And that ideal is what we want you to carry away with you when you leave here this weekend. Now, what we've done, and you have it on your table, just so that you know that there are many cases that happened before the 1950s and after the 1950s. We've created somewhat of a timeline for you of important cases, and we could not include every single case that was important, but we hope that we've captured a lot of them. We've also included a number of lawyers. Obviously, not all of the lawyers who were instrumental in this movement. But, you know, it's also going to be posted on the web. So we'd like to draw your attention to that. But now, I'd like to get to the important part. And that is our first panel, who will be led by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, Judge Bernice Donald. She has been the first in a number of situations. And in this particular panel that she's leading, eyewitnesses to the civil rights movement, indeed, she was an eyewitness herself. Those of us who are of a certain age and born in certain parts of the country, we know what it was like to go to water fountains that said coloreds only, whites only. And in my town, I was in the 12th grade before the last park allowed blacks to go, public park. So you have all of the bios of Diarmy Bailey, Sarah Collins Rudolph, and Frankie Muse Freeman, who I have to give a special note, who was National Vice President of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated when I was made. And so, with that, I'd like to turn it over to Judge Donald. Thank you so much.
I'm so very honored to have been invited to moderate this very significant panel. As Paulette mentioned, I am a judge on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Thanks to Elaine Jones and others, the first African-American woman to serve on that court. And I can say to you, and I can say that with pride because I, like so many of you, stand on the shoulders of the many men and women who were the generals and the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement. I am here today because they stood up. They stood up to violence, to beatings. They stood up in the face of lynchings, of snarling dogs, of bombings, of powerful water hoses, and of angry mobs. And I can stand up here today with pride because they sat down at lunch counters and on streetcars in defiance of Jim Crow laws that existed during that time. I sit on the court today because they stood and demanded the right to vote. And I can dispense justice today with safety and security because they dared to stand up and demand the right to vote, and because they endured injustices each and every day of their existence. Now, many of you in this room today were not born during those times, and you know nothing of what those individuals went through. But we are the nation that we are today because of their sacrifice and their struggle. Our nation has always espoused lofty ideals. We've always espoused equality and justice. But the words of equality and justice are only words on a piece of paper that can be intentionally or conspiratorially ignored without the hands and the hearts and the commitment of people that we're going to be talking about today and who sit on this stage today. And it is for that reason that I say, regardless of skin color, regardless of status, all of us owe a debt of gratitude to the men and women who fought, bled, who sacrificed, and many who died, that we might have a nation that dared to try and live up to its founding documents. Dr. Martin Luther King said that human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. And today we have some of those dedicated individuals, and we're going to hear from them. We have a unique opportunity today to hear from three people who were intimately involved in various ways in the civil rights movement. They're all leaders in their own right. Some of them have national renown, others less so. But all of them were critical in the struggle. I want to start today with an icon in my community and a dear friend, Judge Diarmy Bailey. Judge Bailey is a lawyer, a retired circuit judge, and the founder of the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. That is the museum which was the hotel where Dr. King was assassinated. Judge Bailey at the time said that it would be a travesty for that motel to be torn down and for the world to not remember the tragic events that happened there. And through his effort and action, today it is a shining museum that is a beacon of education to a nation. In addition to being a powerful lawyer and a wonderful judge, Judge Bailey is also an author. He's written 2 books, one, Mine Eyes Have Seen, a second one, The Education of a Black Radical. He's also an actor, having acted in a number of movies, including The People vs. Larry Flint, Mystery Train, and How Stella Got Her Groove Back. And he's always acting and talking and lecturing all across the country. And I want to start asking him the first question, and that is, Judge Bailey, many of the young people here in this room, as I said, were not born during what is considered really the height of the civil rights movement between, I guess, 54 and 68 and early 70s. But we know it went on, as Paulette said, much longer. But I want to ask you, what was it like for African Americans living in a nation which was a constitutional democracy during the time of the civil rights movement, and why did we have to endure that struggle in order to get to where we are today?
I was down in Mississippi last week at Delta State Community College, and I was talking on a panel with some civil rights activists, and some young people stood up and said, well, we owe you a debt of gratitude. We stand on your shoulders. And I said to the young people, don't thank me. I don't really feel that people need to thank me for anything that I did. I need to thank American society for the opportunity that I had as a young person growing up to learn how to make a difference, to take a hold of the circumstances of your life and to fight and to force change. And that was what I experienced growing up in a segregated Memphis in the 1950s and 1940s, when, as has been noted, the lunch counters were segregated and restaurants in the schools, and we'd have to go in the back alleys. But I never really felt that I was oppressed. We lived in a good community of black people who were working hard and supporting it, and we were aspiring. I was first generation college when I left Memphis in 1959 and went off to Southern University in Baton Rouge, the nation's largest all-black college. And I didn't know in 1959 when I left to go to Southern as a freshman that I was stepping off into history. But during my first year at Southern University, in March, actually in February of 1960 as a freshman, was when those students at North Carolina A&T sat in at the lunch counters there. And a month later, the spirit of those students' rebellion spread to other college campuses in the South. And my campus at Southern University in Baton Rouge was one of those campuses. And so instead of now being preoccupied with football and girls and some study, we began to look at the broader implications of this social movement that was rolling across the South with these students, Tennessee State and Alabama State, and Florida. And so our students at Southern went down and sat in at the lunch counters, and some of them got arrested. In fact, it led to the first Supreme Court decision guaranteeing the rights of demonstrators, Garner versus Louisiana, that reversed the conviction of some of those students from Southern who were arrested in 1960. But that was the milieu in which I found myself as a college freshman. The maturity of revolutionary spirit among young people who were taking control of their own futures. And the university expelled me in my sophomore year, junior year from university. Most of the students they were throwing out for getting arrested. Well, I didn't get arrested, so they had a rule that said lack of university adjustment. And the university reserves the right to sever a student's connection for general inability to adjust to the patterns of the institution. And they threw me out. Well, that rule had been used to expel homosexual students, as I later learned. But I then ended up going to college up in Massachusetts, where I finished my education. Now, then I saw the issues of race from a northern perspective. And they told me when I got up to Worcester, oh, well, you know, everything's nice here, don't worry, we're glad to have you. And so long as I was talking about the South, that was fine. But when I began to talk about issues of race in Massachusetts, and we began to organize, then it became a problem. And we protested and we demonstrated, Judge Donald, but I got young white folks, because most of the kids on my campus were white up there in Massachusetts. So we organized and protested and brought Malcolm X to speak on the campus. And then from my experience in Massachusetts on to law school, and then my dear friend Elaine Jones, who I met, she was a law student at the University of Virginia at the time. I was running an organization of law students all over the country. We were sending law students down into the South, a group called Law Student Civil Rights Research Council. Moved out to California, got elected to the city council in Berkeley. But let me say this. One of the protest demonstrations, and I want to read to you and then I'm going to stop, just to give you a sense of what the experience of a young college student was. And this is about a day that we marched in downtown Baton Rouge because our students were in jail down there. And this was 2 years after the Garner case, 1962. Things had quieted down. The university had expelled the first wave of protesters. Things were quiet. We burgeoned back up. Students went down and got arrested. So we marched, some 2,000 to 3,000 students from the campus to downtown Baton Rouge, about 10 miles on a rainy day. And as we stood out there in front of that jail, and we were making our talks, the students were in the second story of the jail, fronting on the street. And they could hear us, and they started singing freedom songs. I'll read from my book, The Education of a Black Radical. It is impossible to describe what it feels like to be shot with tear gas. I could say that it makes your skin sting and burn so badly you think it is peeling off your hands and face. I could say it makes your eyes feel as if they've been set on fire, and then it makes your eyes water so steadily you cannot see. I could say that when the harsh, pungent gas fills your lungs, it is as if two great hands have reached up and squeezed your diaphragm and then placed a bag over your head so you cannot breathe. But these descriptions, while accurate, don't convey the full effect of the experience. Even more difficult to explain is that the anger I felt that December afternoon as the tear gas canisters exploded throughout the streets of downtown Baton Rouge was of an intensity I had never before known. All the hellish years, all the indignity and injustice, all the times a white person had refused to acknowledge me, all the times I had been insulted, welled up inside me, all those feelings and memories broke through the walls of restraint that I had built around them and came together in one hard mass of anger. And some part of me said no more. Some part of me said, I will not live my life in the back alleys of the world. And I hardened myself to the fact that though my purpose was good, if I stood by it, anything could happen. The instant Sheriff Clemens hollered, "Move him out," one of the deputies threw tear gas canister that struck Reverend Cox on the ankle as it exploded, knocking him to the ground. As several students rushed to carry Cox to safety, canisters exploded in quick succession up and down St. Louis Street. Confused and hysterical, we all began running, blindly trying to escape the swirling gas. Shoes, umbrellas, and purses littered the streets. I could hear the unmistakable barking of police dogs and the whining of the sirens mixing with the almost overwhelming noise of student screams, scattered singing, and the sharp explosions of the tear gas canisters. Of course, there was nothing to do but run. To run as fast as you could, and to try not to wipe your eyes, because as I found out too late, that made it worse. As I ducked down the nearest alley, I reminded myself that I had known that this was possible. Before I had agreed to come, I reminded myself that the police could and would get away with whatever they decided to do. I tried to convince myself that I had known and experienced these things, but I hadn't, not really. I hadn't known I would be so afraid. I hadn't known about the dogs or about not being able to breathe. I hadn't known what it would feel like to wonder as I ran with the police at my back if they might use those shotguns and if the bullets might hit me. But I ran anyway. I ran down alleys and tried to catch my breath in the driveways, in the doorways of buildings, when a cloud of gas overwhelmed me. I closed my eyes and groped my way along the nearest wall. I ran looking for safety and fresh air, and I felt that though I might eventually find some air to breathe, I would never be safe anywhere. I hated that feeling, but I hated the white police more.
A passage from The Education of a Black Radical. Judge Bailey, staying with you for a while, you mentioned one of the student organizations. And as you've heard me say, that I lived in Olive Branch, Mississippi. And when I was a young person, there were lawyers who came to Olive Branch to help try and desegregate public accommodations and to register people to vote. Three young white lawyers. I don't know whether they were your organization or from SNCC or wherever, but two were from California and one was from New York. And you know, they stayed in people's homes and actually really motivated people and encouraged people to get involved and step out there, even in the face of anger. Were you involved in SNCC, and if so, what role did they play in this movement, not just in the South, but across the country?
Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was one of the organizations that was of students headquartered in Atlanta with John Lewis and Julian Bond, some wonderful, great freedom fighters that I had the chance to meet while I was down at Southern. Some of them, the civil rights movement, SNCC was very involved in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, was very involved in Louisiana. So things were sort of divided up. It just fell that way with the different groups. So when I was in Louisiana involved, it was mostly Congress of Racial Equality. Lawyers, by the way, were representing all of us from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in New York, and then in later years from some other organizations like the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee. My involvement, once I had been involved on the streets of Louisiana and did some organizing and protesting in Washington, D.C. in the summer of '63, and was arrested in a demonstration in Baltimore, July 4th of '63, along with Mickey Sworn and some other civil rights activists. But after I'd come out of law school, I ran an organization headquartered at the National Office of the American Civil Liberties Union called LISCRIC, Law Student Civil Rights Research Council. And the notion of that organization was, and it was funded by private foundations, that if we could recruit law students, and we had chapters at 30 or 40 law schools around the country. Lane was the head of our chapter at the University of Virginia. That if we could recruit law students and put them in internships, and we paid them subsistence wages, $30, $40 a week, and we'd assign them to go down into the South and to work with these organizations, and we assigned some directly with civil rights leaders, like Fannie Lou Hamer in Ruleville, Mississippi, and with law firms such as Collins, Douglas, and Eli Black Firm in New Orleans, Ratner, Sugarman in Memphis. In Atlanta, it was Judge Ward Moore and Alexander, Howard Moore and Horace Ward. We brought these law students from campuses from UCLA all the way to New York University, to Columbia, to Fordham, and all those places in between, sent them to the South. If you put law students into these hotbeds of change, that not only could they be effective in helping those communities, but what was more important to us was to acclimate these young, upper middle class, mostly white students to the realities of racial friction and tension in America, on the thought that by being involved at this early age, they would continue to be involved in later years, and that has certainly been the case by that involvement. So that was, and we can talk a little bit later about some of the great work that the lawyers did, but the young people, and I as a young person during that time, made an enormous difference in the communities where we worked, but those communities also had an enormous influence and effect upon us.
Now that you've had at least some sense of the big picture, I want to focus and talk with one of the lawyers who was on the ground and leading critical work on the legal and political landscape for the cause of African Americans and really for the cause of a nation. Raised in the Jim Crow era in a tobacco town in Virginia, Mrs. Frankie Muse Freeman earned a law degree from Howard University and became a civil rights activist who led work on groundbreaking litigation and tore down barriers to equal housing and public education. She was part of the NAACP legal team in a case called Bruton versus the Board of Education in St. Louis, a case that predated Brown versus the Board of Education and challenged the city's application of the separate but equal doctrine. She also led the legal team that, with the decision in Davis and others versus St. Louis Housing Authority, successfully ended racial discrimination in housing in St. Louis. Mrs. Freeman was also the first person named to the United States, she was also the first woman, pardon me, named to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. She was appointed by President Lyndon Johnson, whom she met here in St. Louis. And interestingly, that work that she did on the Civil Rights Commission the hearings that they had, that was instrumental in shaping the Civil Rights Act, which was ultimately passed and made a huge difference across the country. As Paulette mentioned, I grew up in Olive Branch, and I attended segregated schools most of my life. It's interesting. Is she ready? Okay. It's interesting that first of the Brown cases was filed before I was born. When Brown versus the Board of Education came down in '54, I was 3 years old. Don't do the math, please. Yet when I started school in a 2-room cinder block school in Olive Branch, Mississippi, with the first and second grades in one room and the third grade in a second room. No running water, no indoor facilities. And the kids from the church, because our school only went to the 8th grade in that community, but the kids from the church would bring down these big 10-gallon things of water so that the little kids could have water to drink. But that was years after Brown. And that's why I say to you that laws are not self-executing. They depend on the hands and hearts and the commitment of good people like you to lead, to make certain that our actions match our rhetoric. And I now want to introduce you to Mrs. Frankie Muniz Freeman, and I've sort of been ad-libbing until she got ready, but Mrs. Freeman, I want to talk with you just a little bit and have you talk to us about your motivation for stepping out at personal risk, in many cases, to challenge the establishment to ensure that people had the right to equal public education and equal housing. I want to go back to one of the first cases, the landmark case of Bruton, where you represented some brothers who wanted to take a course in airplane mechanics at a white school. And there was resistance, but you took that case and made certain that the law applied. Tell us a little bit about what compelled you to get involved at the level of your involvement in civil rights.
First of all, I'm going to say I got involved because of where I came from. I grew up in Denver, Virginia, which everyone was segregated, everything was separated. And so when I graduated from Hampton Law School in 1947, I was determined that I was going to be a civil rights lawyer, and moved to, when we came to St. Louis, because that was my husband's home, I immediately contacted the NAACP and said that I would be available as an attorney to help in any cases. I had opened my own law office in June 1949 as a sole practitioner, because after graduating from law school and being recommended to some of the firms in St. Louis, they offered me, they said I could come and, help them with the typing, and I was going to be a trial attorney. So I had my own trial attorney. But when the cases in 1949, as all of you probably know, all of the schools in 17 states were racially segregated. In St. Louis, there was Washington Technical High School for black students, Hadley for white students. In 1949, they announced that there would be a course in airplane mechanics at Hadley, which was a school for white students. Bruton brothers, there were 3 of them, all who were watching and hearing and knowing about airplane mechanics. When they heard about that, they said that's what they wanted. So their parents, who probably knew what the result would be, answer would be, went to Hadley and said that their students wanted to be admitted. They were denied. They went to the NAACP, who contacted Sidney Redmond, Henry Espin, and by that time and me. And we filed suit in the circuit court, challenging the fact that they could offer a course and not admit the black students, when there was no such course at Hadley. That case was argued in the circuit court in the city of St. Louis and decided in favor of the Bruton brothers. The Board of Education of the City of St. Louis appealed it to the Supreme Court of Missouri, and it was still decided in favor, after briefs were filed and all, in favor of the Bruton brothers. And when the order came down to the Board of Education that they could not deny admission to the black students, then what the Board of Education did was to drop the course in airplane mechanics for the white students. During that same time, there were problems with respect to low-income housing. Low-income housing had been authorized by the Congress in 1937, and there'd never been any law requiring racial segregation in public housing. However, in St. Louis, there was Clinton Peabody on the south side for white families and Cosgrave Village on the north side for black families. During the war, the construction of additional housing had been interrupted, and then in 1952, they were completing Cochran, which was designated for white families only. They were also building Pruitt-Igoe, which was not going to be ready for about 2 years. So there were families who were in need of housing. There was nothing available at Cosgrave Village. Some were veterans, and so they came again to the NACP. I contacted the national office, and we received the support of the national office and filed suit in federal court against the St. Louis Housing Authority. Now, what the St. Louis Housing Authority did, of course, in their response, they justified the racial separation and by using the fact that all of the other organizations in St. Louis were racially divided. They even listed the YWCA and the YMCA and all. However, we argued that case in October 1954, which was after the Brown case. So then thereafter, the federal court in St. Louis declared racial segregation in public housing unconstitutional, and that eliminated racial segregation. In the meantime, or thereafter, in 1958, the Congress enacted the legislation creating the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And that created, for six-member commission, requiring confirmation of the individuals by the Senate, and also indicating it was an independent agency. In the meantime, I had been brought to the attention of the first President Kennedy as a person who would be a member, but all of the six commissioners in the beginning from 1958 until 1964 were male. And President Kennedy had announced that he was going to appoint women to positions. And I was first interviewed in the White House by someone, I've forgotten the name, for the commission because of my work in civil rights. That was on November the 17th, 1963, but the following week, there was the assassination, and I thought it was over with. However, in February, I met with President Lyndon Johnson, who had come to St. Louis for the Democrats, and who told me that he had checked me out. He checked me out with the NAACP and Whitney Young, but he had not told them that he was considering the Civil Rights Commission because they would have recommended a man and he was going to appoint a female. I was nominated and confirmed by the Senate. In the meantime, I was also, prior to the confirmation, I was at least invited to attend the meetings. We were, following my confirmation, we at least recognized that the Civil Rights Commission had a duty to investigate all of the things that had been happening in Mississippi and in other places, denying the right to vote. There had been murders, there had been beatings, 4 churches had been burned, and the decision was made to hold a hearing in Jackson, Mississippi in February of 1965. The Attorney General had suggested that perhaps there would be some question because they were investigating some of the beatings, and they suggested maybe we should not hold a hearing, but we voted to hold a hearing, and we held the hearing in Jackson, Mississippi in February of 1965. In the meantime, there had been a lot of publicity about the fact that all of the things that were happening, all of the denial of the right to vote, there were 2 counties in Mississippi where there was not one black person who was registered to vote because they were all given questions to interpret the Constitution to the satisfaction of the registrar. But when they made their interpretation, they were not able to satisfy the registrar. In the event, and then during our hearing, when we subpoenaed the persons who were giving those questions, we asked the registrar to interpret one of those that he had given, and he was not able to interpret it. On the basis of...
And Mrs. Freeman,
in
your book, I think there's a passage in there where you're the one who really insisted that he be held accountable and he explain or interpret this particular passage, knowing that he probably wouldn't be able to do that. Is that correct?
Right. In addition, I also got some special attention in Jackson, Mississippi. The newspaper, they published, they had, in fact, I even have a copy of that article, in which they said, a Negro woman lawyer from St. Louis is now in Jackson as a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Closed-door sessions of that federal agency, headed by President of Michigan State University, are hearing complaints of alleged violence against colored sisters and denial of their civil rights. The Negro woman lawyer, as well as her commissioner, could have stayed at home. and they went on with 3 other columns about St. Louis, where I should have stayed back here. But we didn't. We made recommendations to the Congress, and 3 of the recommendations which we made were included and are part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Mrs. Freeman, as a commissioner, and of course I know you mentioned the people with whom you served, but you heard some very vivid testimony about what was happening on the ground in Mississippi. Hearing those things, how did that serve, if at all, to motivate what you did as a commissioner for the cause of civil rights? And how did it affect you personally?
First of all, it had an impelling effect on not just me, but the fact that at least the people in Mississippi started voting. during the following months, when I was checking on voter registration around the country, in the North, I found that one of the things that we talked about was the denial of the right to vote. That when I would make my political speeches, and I wasn't supposed to be doing that, talk about that here. But anyway, I would say to them, in Mississippi they can't vote. You have nobody telling you you can't vote. Get out and vote right. And of course, I still say you need to do that now. But
okay. There's one other question that I want to ask you before I lose the time, because I may not be able to get back. And you were very involved. You were on the front lines. You were a leader in a very visible position and doing some really significant work. And you say in your book that there are still very pressing issues of civil rights that confront us today. What do you believe are the most pressing civil rights issues that our country faces right now?
Education, and of course, exercising the right to vote. We still have one of the problems that's happening in several states around this country is that there are legislation denying the right to vote right now in certain places, in certain states. There are people who will not be able to vote unless, of course, the NAACP, ACLU, and other people, and all the lawyers here, you can work, be sure that some of those laws are eliminated because they're basically unconstitutional. Our Constitution talks about the consent of the governed. That means that all of the citizens have a right to vote, and there is no reason for any fiction with respect to trying to keep everybody from voting. But I still think also we were concerned about racial segregation in the schools, lack of adequate support for the schools. And we focused in many cases on the South. But if you saw an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, there is racial segregation throughout the United States in education. If we don't ever get to know each other, we will never understand each other. We will not necessarily respect each other. So there is much that needs to be done, and the lawyers, of course, have done a lot, but we all need to do more.
Thank you very much, Ms. Freeman. Thank you so much. While legal pioneers like Mrs. Frankie Muse Freeman pushed for legal and legislative changes to end discrimination, and while people like Judge Bailey, some years later, worked and suffered the effects of tear gas canisters and of exclusion and expulsion, many more African Americans struggled through day-to-day discrimination and endured clashes with racism and violence. And I'm going to come back to Judge Bailey in a bit, but I want to talk about one of the faces, one of the victims, because all of these things that people are talking about in the cases, somewhere in this there are real people who suffered the bite of the dog, who suffered the inhalation of the tear gas, who suffered the beating of the officer's nightsticks, who were jailed. One of the civil rights era's most influential stories, and we're coming up on the 50th anniversary, was that you all have all read about, of 4 little girls killed on Sunday morning, September 15th, 1963, in the basement of the Birmingham 16th Street Baptist Church. That event the Klansmen who planted those 16 sticks of dynamite under the stairwell of that church had in mind that they would quell that movement, that they would, in essence, kill it. What they did by their acts, they killed some people, but the killing of a person is not enough to kill a movement. What they did through that act was to reinvigorate that movement and make people more determined than ever to end segregation in Birmingham. It drew the attention of a nation on the horrors that people had endured day in and day out in that hotbed of the movement. That single event reverberated around the world and served as a catalyst for decades of direct action in the civil rights movement. In just a moment, we're going to show you a video, and for those who are listening to live streaming, you will not be able to see the video streamed, but you will be able to view that video on the ABA website or on YouTube, and information about that is on our website. Not many people know, when we hear about the 4 girls who were killed, not many people know that there was a 5th girl who was in that basement, who was injured by that blast, who was buried along with the others, but who survived. She survived physically, but she had so much emotional scarring, so much psychological scarring, and she was left, like so many others, to fend for herself in terms of her own healing and her own dealing with the nightmare of that event. And she's with us here today, this courageous woman who survived, Miss Sarah Collins Rudolph. She was later able to confront 2 of the bombers in court some 40 years later as they were brought to justice and were found guilty and received life sentences. Please join me in welcoming Miss Sarah Collins Rudolph. Sarah, September 15th, 1963, you and your family went to church. You and several of your sisters, and I believe some of your brothers. It was Youth Day that Sunday at the church, and you were, along with other people, in the basement of the church. Can you go back to that moment and tell us, what you were doing and what you were feeling just before the terrible events of that day occurred?
I remember while we was in the basement of the church, how we didn't go to our class that morning because we didn't really like our class. It was Ada, my sister Ada, and myself. We didn't like our class, so we stayed there in the basement. And when the Sunday school turned out, I remember how Denise McNair, Cynthia Wesley, Karen Robinson, and my sister, Denise McNair, Cynthia Wesley, Karen Robinson, when they came into the bathroom, my sister Ada was standing by the stained glass window, and I was standing by the sink. So when they came in, they went on to the other side where the stalls was. So when they came out, Ada was standing by the window, so Denise McNair asked Ada to tie the sash on her dress. And when she began to tie the sash, she reached her hands out, and I was looking from the sink toward her, just watching her to see her tie the sash, but I never did get a chance to see her tie because all of a sudden I heard a loud noise, and I didn't know what it was, but I heard someone outside the side say somebody bombed the church. But anyway, when the bomb went off, all I could say was Jesus, because it scared me so bad. And I called out to my sister Addie. I called her name about 3 times, but I didn't get an answer. So I heard this sound. It was so close on it, like the sound was from the inside, but right there where the steps was, it had blew a cradle into the church, and somebody ran inside, and they bought me out. And when they bought me out of the church, they put me in the ambulance and carried me to Hillman Hospital.
Now, I'm sorry, go ahead. So you said that you didn't really remember anything, I don't believe, from the last thing you remembered was when hearing the bomb blast and hearing the calling and the loud sounds, and then you ended up in the hospital, is that correct?
Yeah.
Tell me how you were physically damaged as a result of that bomb. What injuries did you receive?
The glass from the stained glass window, it debris from it blinded me, and I had so many pieces of glasses in my face and in my ears and both of my eyes, because I was really blinded right after the bomb went off.
And how many months did you remain in the hospital?
I remained in the hospital about 2.5 months. And while I was in the hospital, when I got there, at least my sister, she came in, and I overheard her tell someone that I didn't know that Ada was killed, so I had asked her what was Ada. So she told me that Ada had hurt her back, but she would be there to see me tomorrow. But while I laid on the stretcher, I was laying up there waiting for the doctor to come in, because they said the doctor wasn't there. So I laid there and I overheard her tell someone that one of her sisters was killed in the bombing, and I had got all upset. I didn't say anything, but it really upset me, because by me being the age of 12, I didn't understand why she was killed.
Now, you were 12 years old at the time. Were you aware of the environment and what was going on in Birmingham at the time these events occurred? And were you aware of why there was so much, animosity or hatred toward blacks in Birmingham? What did you know about that at that time?
Yes, I knew about it. I knew about the marches and how they was protesting to get their civil rights. And they marched. 16th Street Baptist Church was the headquarters where they would meet. And
and that was your church?
Yes, ma'am. 16th Street Baptist Church. And they would leave from there and try to march to get our equal rights and, rights to sit at the lunchroom counters and to use the restrooms and the voting, and so they started marching from there.
Now, after a time when so many of the adults in the movement were being arrested and jailed, there was a Minister Shuttleworth, who decided that one of the strategies might be to get young people, students, involved. Did you ever participate in those marches under the direction of Reverend Shuttleworth?
Yes, I remember how my mother would take us to his office he had an office on 4th Avenue downtown, and she would take us there on a Saturday to march. We would get our signs, and we would line up in twos, and we would march to the Jefferson Courthouse, and we were singing songs like "We Shall Overcome," and we would just sing, and he would lead us there to the courthouse.
Okay, I want to go back a moment to the time you were in the hospital. You said that you had glass in your eyes. As a result of that, did you suffer any permanent damage to your eyes? And if so, how did that affect you?
Yes, when they had operated on my eyes and they took the bandage off about 2 weeks, about a week later, and when they took the bandage off, the doctor asked me what could I see, and I told him I see a little light out of my left eye, but I was blind in my right eye. So I remember how I used to lay up in the room all the time. And
Did they ultimately remove your eye?
Yes, ma'am. They didn't do it right then, but they told my mother to bring me back in February. Mm-hmm. They was gonna have to remove my right eye so I wouldn't go blind in my left eye.
Okay. And as a young child, with them having removed your eye, you were self-conscious about that, were you not?
Yes, I was very self-conscious because it was a scary thing, you know, to have my right eye move, and really I didn't know what they was going to do. I didn't do anything about prosthetic or anything then, so I was always nervous and upset and just wondering how would I look with just one eye, and but it just had me all upset, and my nerves started bothering me, and I had so much of fear on the inside. And I remember when I used to go to bed at night, how looked like I felt like things were just crawling on me, and no matter how I was, you know, scratch or anything, I was always the same way. And I found out later that it was my nerves.
Okay, and I know we just have a little bit of time left, so I want to ask you this. You ultimately participated in the trial of Bobby Frank Cherry and I believe Blanton or Cash, one of the others. When you saw them in court after all these years, what reaction did you have to them? When you looked at their faces, what did you see?
Well, when I seen them in court, I was really bitter because these men they spend their lives, it was 63 when the bombing was, but they didn't have their trial until year 202. And I was so bitter about it because they lived their life, but these girls, they didn't get a chance to live their life.
But did it ultimately bring you a sense of closure once they were convicted and spent life in prison?
Yes, it brought me some closure.
Okay, and I'm going to have to stop right there because I want to go back to Judge Bailey very quickly because we only have 2 minutes. Judge Bailey, you took the extraordinary step of stepping out and creating a monument for education from the place where Dr. King was killed. What compelled you to do that, and why is that so important for all of us today?
I returned to Memphis after living in the Bay Area. I came back to Memphis in 1974 and started practicing law. The Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was killed by that time was a rundown facility. Prostitutes were up and down the street in front of it. The city had basically neglected the Lorraine Motel, and it was just decaying, and the prostitute business really was what helped to keep the doors open. And Mr. Walter Bailey, who was no relationship to me, was the owner, a black man. His wife had had a stroke the night of the assassination, and she died 2 days later. He was losing the property to foreclosure, and so some of us in the black community began to organize a campaign to raise money and buy it. And we bought the building in foreclosure in 1982 on the courthouse steps. Now, you own the Lorraine Motel, private citizens. We're not doing it for profit. We all have our own businesses. What are you going to do with it? And I had been down there with a couple of ministers from East Germany, and one of them stood and looked up at the balcony, and he said, "This is a holy site." And I knew that if you take a holy site, and from my own experience in the civil rights movement, if you can tell the story of that movement, this was not to be a monument to King. This was a monument to the people out in the field, to people who were down there in Birmingham and Montgomery and all over the South, to tell the story of that struggle, that if we could capture that with an exhibition at that site where people would come from all over the world, that perhaps we could continue to carry the message of sacrifice and dedication that was so great. And that's why when I started, I said that the young people don't owe me any gratitude and thanks. They have a tougher job, and we have to provide them the inspiration and the sense of possibilities. And that's what that museum to me represents.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you. And let me just say that the civil rights era was a time of change so sweeping and so substantial that it would have never been possible without exceptional leaders and exceptional participants. Leaders willing to devote time, effort, and personal sacrifice to this essential human cause. Our panelists today met that definition and exceeded it. They were exceptional leaders, and if, are my pictures ready? Okay. I'm not very technologically. I wanted to show you just a couple of pictures while I talk. Okay. Well, that's a picture from Dr. King in the Birmingham jail. I wanted to show you, this was a bus where students were making their way to Alabama and New Orleans, the Freedom Riders. They were bombed. They were set up by the police at Anniston, Alabama. They were bombed. Another bus came. Some of them eventually made it, I think, to Birmingham. I'm not sure they ever made it to Atlanta. People who were attacked. This is a high school student who was attacked by a dog. The students were all nonviolent. They'd been trained in nonviolence, but they were met, of course, with violence. These were the water hoses. The pressure from those water hoses were so strong, it was so strong that it would rip the bark off of trees. These water hoses were turned on students, some of them as young as 9, 10, 11 years old. Many of these kids were catapulted high enough in the air that they went over automobiles. But that was the force that the government met them with. Here you'll see some of the cars. The bomb blast at Birmingham at the 16th Street Jail was so strong that it actually knocked a passerby out of his car on the street. That was the force of that bomb. Here you will see one of the, I believe this is Cash, one of the bombers who was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. This was another one, maybe this is Cash, I think the other one was Blanton. He was also convicted, I believe in 2001, and sentenced to life in prison. I don't have a picture of Bobby Frank Cherry, but he was one, and this is one of the wonderful things. His granddaughter, Bobby Frank Cherry's granddaughter, had heard her father, who was a truck driver, bragging about some of the actions he'd taken against these civil rights actors, and she basically turned her grandfather in. She cooperated with the FBI, and they used a lot of that in order to get a conviction against him. So it's my hope today that in listening to today's panel, you've come away inspired to apply their stories to your cause, to your life's work, and that when there is a difficult situation that will move our country even further toward its goals, that you will step forward, even at risk to your own safety and reputation, but you will step forward rather, and join the cause and do the right thing. Let me ask you to join me in thanking our panel, and their books are on sale outside.